Welcome to our discussion on the House and the Senate compared. Although the House of Representatives and the Senate share numerous functions, the two chambers of Congress differ in significant ways. As President Woodrow Wilson remarked, the House and Senate are naturally unalike. Constitutionally, the two houses are conceived as unique organizations, and the framers designated their duties to match the strengths and expertise of the people who would come to hold office in each chamber. There are major differences between the two. As we discussed earlier in this chapter, the Constitution empowers the House of Representatives as the legislative body closer to the people, with initiating any bills that result in taxes, whereas it empowers the Senate as the more deliberative house to give the President advice and consent on appointments and the ratification of treaties. The differences between the House and the Senate are not limited merely to their functions. However, the electoral and legislative structures are also sources of differences between the two houses. Each of the 435 current members of the House of Representatives represents a legislative district determined by the reapportionment and redistricting process that occurs every 10 years, as described earlier in this chapter. In more populated areas, these congressional districts are often homogeneous, cohesive units in which a House member's constituency is likely to have fairly unified positions on many issues. Senators, however, are elected by the population of an entire state. And although the political culture in some states is somewhat cohesive, for example, Vermont voters are more liberal on most issues than our Kansas voters, in many states there are notable differences in constituents' views, ideology, and political priorities. For instance, Senators Barbara Boxer and Dianne Feinstein both represent the entire state of California and both are Democrats. Although California is generally viewed as a very liberal political culture, Boxer and Feinstein also must represent the interests of both liberal voters in the western coastal areas of the state and more conservative voters inland to the east. At times, moreover, the interests of a senator's constituents divide over a given issue. In California, for example, environmental activists and fishers have argued against programs that divert water from lakes and streams so that it can be used for irrigation on commercial farms, whereas affluent agribusiness advocate water diversion. A U.S. senator must balance such conflicting positions when making policy decisions. The differing length of representatives' and senators' terms of service affects how members of each chamber of Congress relate to their constituents. Given their short 2-year terms, members of the House of Representatives naturally are reluctant to defy the will of the electorate on a given issue because of the likelihood that their opposition will be used against them during their re-election campaign. As the framers structured it, the House remains the people's House, the chamber in which civically engaged individuals can effectively have their interests represented. And although U.S. senators naturally also want to please their constituents, they recognize that voting against their constituents' will on a particular issue might be less significant than such an action would be for a House member, especially if the issue arises early in their term and is not important enough for people to hold against them 6 years down the road. The size of the chambers and the length of terms also affect the relative prestige of each chamber. In general, the smaller Senate is considered more prestigious than the House of Representatives, although some individual House members may enjoy more prestige than some senators. Although the House and the Senate differ in their constitutionally determined duties, both must pass any piece of legislation before it can become law. But the way in which legislation is considered and voted upon differs in each House of Congress. The larger size of the House of Representatives, with its 435 members, necessitates a more formal legislative structure to prevent unruliness. The House, for example, generally has more formal rules guiding debate than the Senate. Despite the differences between the two chambers, the legislative process is remarkably similar in both.